Imagine a world long past, a time shrouded in the mists of prehistory, where legends whisper of beings that defied the natural order. Figures of immense stature and power walked the earth, blurring the lines between the human and the divine. These weren't just campfire tales. Their story is embedded within the pages of one of the world's most influential texts, the Book of Genesis, hinting at a time of profound transgression, cosmic upheaval, and beings known as the Nephilim. Deep within the early chapters of Genesis, nestled just before the cataclysmic account of the Great Flood, lies a passage that has baffled scholars, ignited imaginations, and fueled debate for millennia. It's a mere 4 verses, Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, yet it contains a narrative so potent, so cryptic, that its echoes resonate through theology, mythology, and even modern popular culture. Listen closely to the words themselves. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man and they bore children to them. They were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." These few lines unleash a torrent of questions. Who exactly were these sons of God? Were they divine beings, angels stepping beyond their celestial bounds? Or perhaps they were human, maybe righteous descendants from the line of Seth or powerful earthly rulers. And who were the daughters of men they found so alluring? Were they simply human women, or did they represent a specific lineage, perhaps the descendants of Cain? And, crucially, what were the Nephilim? The text tells us they were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, born from the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Were they giants, as tradition often holds? Demigods? Fearsome tyrants? The text calls them mighty men, men of renown, but the name Nephilim itself is shrouded in linguistic mystery, possibly meaning the fallen ones, or perhaps those who cause others to fall. And why is this strange account placed immediately before God's decision to cleanse the world with a flood? Is there a direct link between these unions, the Nephilim, and the overwhelming wickedness that prompted such a drastic divine judgment? For thousands of years, interpreters have wrestled with these verses. The answers proposed are as varied as they are fascinating, ranging from fallen angels corrupting humanity to symbolic representations of societal breakdown to cautionary tales about unchecked power. There is no single, universally accepted explanation. Welcome to the Purple Files, where we delve into history's most compelling mysteries and forgotten lore. In this deep dive, we will journey into the heart of this enigma. We'll meticulously examine the biblical text itself, exploring the language and context. We will unpack the major historical interpretations, weighing their strengths and weaknesses. We'll venture beyond the canonical Bible into influential ancient texts, like the Book of Enoch, which offer a far more detailed and frankly shocking account of these events. We will trace the legacy of the Nephilim, looking at later biblical references to giants and exploring how this potent narrative has captivated human imagination right up to the present day. Prepare to explore one of the Bible's most enduring and provocative mysteries, the story of the Nephilim, the mighty men of old. To unravel the mystery of the Nephilim, we must first return to the source, the specific words written millennia ago in the Hebrew text of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The language itself holds the primary clues, but also the roots of the enduring ambiguity. Let's read it once more, carefully considering each phrase. "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. 2. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. 3. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. 4. There were Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown." Right away, we encounter our first major interpretive challenge, the identity of the sons of God. In Hebrew, this is Bnei HaElohim, This exact phrase appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, most notably in the Book of Job, where the Bnei HaElohim present themselves before God and Satan comes along with them. In that context, they are almost universally understood as angelic or divine beings belonging to God's heavenly court. Some passages, like Psalm 82, also speak of Elohim or gods in a divine council context, though interpretations vary. This connection strongly supports the view that Genesis 6 refers to celestial beings interacting with humanity. However, the term Elohim itself can sometimes refer to powerful humans like judges or rulers, leading some interpreters down a different path. Could Bnei Elohim signify powerful human dynasties, or perhaps, as another ancient interpretation suggests, the righteous lineage descending from Adam's son Seth? The text doesn't explicitly define them here, leaving the door open. In contrast, the daughters of men, Benot HaAdam, seems less ambiguous. Adam is the Hebrew word for man or humankind. These are generally understood to be human women. The key element is the contrast being drawn between these two groups. The Benoi Beno HaAdam, whoever the sons of God were, they were distinct from these human women. The text states the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair or attractive, tavot in Hebrew, which can mean good, beautiful or pleasing, and crucially, they took them wives of all which they chose. This phrasing suggests a deliberate action, perhaps driven by lust, and potentially implies a lack of consent or a violation of established boundaries, whether social or cosmic. The phrase, of all which they chose, might hint at excess or indiscriminate selection, a theme often associated with transgression in Genesis. God's reaction in verse 3 is immediate and significant. My spirit shall not always strive, or abide, or rule in man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. This is a divine judgment. It connects the preceding events directly to a divine response concerning humanity's nature, pasa, flesh, and mortality. The meaning of the 120 years is debated. Is it a new maximum lifespan, a period of grace before the flood, or something else entirely? Regardless, it signifies a divine limitation imposed in response to the unfolding situation, linking the actions of the sons of God and daughters of men to a corruption that warrants divine intervention. Then, verse 4 introduces the most famous term, the Nephilim, her-Nephilim. The text states they were on the earth in those days, and also after that. This timing is crucial. It suggests the Nephilim existed both during the time of these unions, and potentially even before or independently of them, and certainly after that, when the unions occurred and produced offspring. The origin of the name Nephilim is highly debated. It likely derives from the Hebrew root naphal, meaning to fall. This leads to translations like the fallen ones, but it could also have an active sense, those who cause others to fall, or perhaps even relate to miscarriage or abortion, Nephilah. Less likely, some connect it to Aramaic words for giants, Nephilah. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, translated Nephilim here as gigantes, the Greek word for giants, which heavily influenced later interpretations, but the original Hebrew meaning likely carried the connotation of fallen, whether literally from heaven or morally. Verse 4 continues, specifying that the Nephilim were present when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men and they bare children to them. This explicitly links the offspring of these unions to the Nephilim, or at least places the Nephilim's presence in the same context. These offspring, or perhaps the Nephilim themselves, are described further. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. The term for mighty men is Hagiborim. Gibor signifies a powerful warrior, a hero, or sometimes a tyrant, like Nimrod later in Genesis, who is also called a Gibor of old. Meolam points to a distant, almost legendary past, and men of renown, Anshech Hashem, literally means men of the name, indicating fame, reputation, perhaps notoriety. They left a significant mark on the world's memory. So the text itself presents us with divine or powerful beings, Bnei HaElohim, transgressing boundaries to unite with human women, Beno HaAdam. This results in a divine judgment limiting human lifespan and is associated with the presence of the mysterious Nephilim, described as mighty, ancient, famous figures, possibly fallen ones or giants. The precise relationship between the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, and the Gibborim remains tantalizingly unclear within these 4 verses alone. The ambiguity baked into these key terms, B'nai Elohim, Nephilim, Gibborim, is precisely why this passage has generated such diverse and enduring interpretations throughout history. Understanding this foundational text, with all its nuances and uncertainties, is the essential first step before we can explore how others have attempted to solve this ancient puzzle. Having examined the cryptic verses of Genesis 6, we now turn to the oldest and arguably most dramatic interpretation of who the sons of God were and what exactly transpired before the flood. This is the fallen angel view. In its simplest form, this interpretation posits that the B'nai Elohim were indeed divine beings, angels, who abandoned their designated heavenly sphere, descended to earth, and engaged in sexual unions with human women, the Benu Ha-Adam. Proponents of this view lean heavily on the textual evidence we've already discussed. The term B'nai Elohim, as used in passages like the Book of Job, most naturally refers to members of God's celestial court, angelic beings. The stark contrast drawn in Genesis 6 between these sons of God and the daughters of men, humankind, reinforces the idea of 2 distinct categories of beings interacting, one divine or semi-divine, the other human. According to this interpretation, the transgression wasn't merely about lust, but about a fundamental violation of cosmic order. These angels abandoned their proper habitation, as the New Testament Epistle of Jude perhaps alludes to, when mentioning angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, Jude verse 6. Their sin involved crossing an ordained boundary between the heavenly and earthly realms and engaging in relationships that were never intended. The phrase, "took them wives of all which they chose," is often seen here as indicating not just marriage, but forceful taking, or lustful, indiscriminate acquisition driven by supernatural power. And what of the offspring, the Nephilim and the Gibborim? In the fallen angel view, these figures are understood as the unnatural result of this forbidden union. They were hybrids, part angelic and part human, often conceived of as giants, possessing supernatural strength, power, and perhaps a corrupt nature inherited from their fallen parentage. The description, mighty men who were of old, men of renown, takes on a more sinister connotation. Their might was potentially terrifying, their renown perhaps infamous. They represented a corruption of God's creation at the deepest level, blurring the lines between divine and human stock. Crucially, the fallen angel interpretation provides a compelling, direct link between the events of Genesis 6 verses 1 to 4 and the subsequent decision by God to bring the flood, trouble. The widespread wickedness mentioned in verse 5, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually," is seen not just as ordinary human sin, but as a profound corruption exacerbated, or even instigated, by this unnatural angelic interference and the actions of their powerful offspring. The earth was corrupt and filled with violence, Genesis 6 verse 11, and this view suggests the Nephilim were primary agents of that violence and corruption. Cleansing the earth with a flood becomes an understandable, almost necessary divine response to restore order and remove this corrupted lineage. This interpretation isn't a modern invention. It has deep historical roots. It was the dominant view in early Judaism during the Second Temple period, roughly 500 BC to 70 AD. Non-canonical texts like the Book of Enoch, 1st Enoch in particular, elaborate extensively on this narrative, naming specific angels like Shemi-Hazar and Azazel, detailing their descent, their lust, the teaching of forbidden knowledge to humans, and the destructive reign of their giant offspring. These texts were highly influential in shaping early Jewish and Christian understanding. Consequently, many prominent early church fathers, including figures like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Clement of Alexandria, adopted and taught the fallen angel view. For centuries, this was the mainstream understanding within much of Christianity. Of course, this view is not without its challenges, which contributed to its decline in popularity later in history. A key theological objection often raised concerns the nature of angels. Are they purely spiritual beings, incapable of physical procreation? Jesus' statement in Matthew chapter 22 verse 30 that angels in heaven neither marry nor are given in marriage is often cited, though proponents argue this refers to angels in heaven in their glorified state, not fallen angels acting in rebellion on earth. Questions about how spiritual beings could physically manifest and interact with humans in this way also arise. These difficulties led some, particularly from the 4th and 5th centuries onward, to seek alternative explanations within the text. These difficulties led some, particularly from the 4th and 5th centuries onward, to seek alternative explanations within the text. Nevertheless, the fallen angel interpretation remains a powerful and historically significant reading of Genesis 6. It directly addresses the language of Bene Elohim, provides a clear motivation for the flood, and accounts for the legendary status of the Nephilim and Gibborim as more than just human figures. Its influence, particularly through texts like Enoch, has profoundly shaped theological discussions and popular imagination regarding angels, demons, giants, and the nature of primeval sin. It sets a dramatic stage, portraying a cosmic struggle with humanity caught in the middle. As theological concerns grew regarding angels engaging in physical relations, and as allegorical interpretations gained favour, particularly from the 4th and 5th centuries AD onwards, an alternative reading of Genesis 6 began to gain prominence. This became known as the Sethite view. It offers a decidedly more human-centric explanation for the events leading up to the flood, shifting the focus from cosmic rebellion to social and religious decay within humanity itself. The core argument of the Sethite view is that the sons of God, the Bene Elohim, were not angels at all, but rather the male descendants of Adam's righteous son Seth. Genesis chapter 4 verse 26 notes that it was during the time of Seth's son Enosh that people began to call upon the name of the Lord. This lineage is often portrayed in Genesis as maintaining faithfulness to God, in contrast to the line of Cain. Therefore, sons of God is interpreted here as a title denoting their piety, their covenant relationship with God, or their godly heritage. Conversely, the daughters of men, Benot Han, are identified specifically with the ungodly lineage of Cain, or sometimes more broadly with worldly, unrighteous humanity outside the faithful Sethite line. Cain's descendants, according to Genesis chapter 4, were associated with city building, polygamy, in the case of Lamech, and violence. The daughters of men represented this worldly, perhaps outwardly attractive, but spiritually compromising part of society. In this interpretation, the transgression described in Genesis 6 is not a supernatural violation but a breakdown of religious and social separation. The righteous Sethite men, attracted by the beauty or allure of the Cainite women, or worldly women in general, abandoned their commitment to God and intermarried with those outside their faithful community. They took them wives of all which they chose, is seen as representing compromise, assimilation, and the dilution of piety through mixed marriages that disregarded godly principles. This mingling led to a widespread apostasy, a turning away from God by the formerly righteous line. So, what about the Nephilim and the Gibborim, the mighty men of old? Within the Sethite framework, these figures are generally understood as entirely human. They might have been the offspring of these mixed unions, perhaps inheriting ambition and power but lacking piety, becoming notable leaders, warriors, or even tyrants. Their might, Gibborim, was earthly power, and their renown, Anshe Hashem, was worldly fame, possibly gained through oppressive or ungodly means. Some proponents might even suggest the term Nephilim, fallen ones, refers metaphorically to the Sethites who fell from their righteous standing through these marriages. Or perhaps it simply refers to notable, powerful figures of that era without implying supernatural origins. This view tends to de-emphasize the literal giant aspect often associated with the Nephilim, seeing it as a later embellishment or misunderstanding. The Sethite view connects this widespread intermarriage and resulting apostasy directly to the universal corruption that necessitated the flood. The wickedness described in Genesis 6 verse 5, every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, is seen as the direct consequence of the godly line compromising its faith and merging with the ungodly world. The breakdown of that separation led to universal sinfulness, prompting God's judgment upon all humanity except Noah's family, representing the last remnant of righteousness, The flood, therefore, remains a response to sin, but the sin originates entirely within the human sphere. This interpretation gained significant traction thanks largely to the influence of St. Augustine of Hippo in the early 5th century AD. In his seminal work, City of God, Augustine explicitly argued against the fallen angel view, partly due to the theological difficulties we mentioned, and championed the Sethite interpretation. His immense authority in Western Christianity meant that the Sethite view became the dominant understanding for much of the medieval and Reformation periods. Major reformers like John Calvin also strongly advocated for this position, cementing its place in Protestant tradition. However, the Sethite view also faces challenges. Its primary weakness lies in the interpretation of B'nai Elohim. As we saw, this term elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible strongly suggests angelic beings. Interpreting it as Sethites requires reading context from Genesis 4 and 5 into chapter 6 in a way the text doesn't explicitly state. Furthermore, critics argue that simple intermarriage between different human lineages, while perhaps sinful, seems an insufficient explanation for the unique, almost mythological language used terms like Nephilim, Gibborim, men of renown, and the immediate, drastic divine response, culminating in a world-destroying flood. It can feel like an anticlimax compared to the cosmic drama implied by the fallen angel view. The Sethite interpretation offers a coherent, historically influential alternative that grounds the Genesis 6 narrative firmly within human history and morality. It avoids the theological complexities of angelic procreation and aligns well with themes of covenant faithfulness and the dangers of assimilation found elsewhere in the Bible. By portraying the conflict as one between righteous and unrighteous human factions, it provides a moral lesson about the importance of spiritual separation and the consequences of compromise. Yet for many, it struggles to fully capture the strange, potent atmosphere and the specific terminology used in those 4 enigmatic verses. Beyond the cosmic drama of fallen angels and the religious narrative of the Sethites, a third significant line of interpretation understands the key figures in Genesis 6 through a socio-political lens. This is often called the human ruler's view, or sometimes the dynastic ruler's interpretation. It suggests that the events described reflect the actions of powerful human kings, nobles, or potentates in the ancient world, perhaps even those who claimed a degree of divinity for themselves. In this view, the term sons of God, B'nai Elohim, is interpreted differently yet again. While acknowledging its common use for angelic beings, proponents point to instances where the Hebrew word Elo, God, or gods, can sometimes refer to human judges, rulers, or those acting with divine authority. For example, in Exodus chapter 21 verse 6 or chapter 22 verses 8 and 9, Elohim appears in contexts referring to human judges or magistrates. Psalm 82 verse 6 famously says, "I said, you are gods, Elohim, sons of the Most High, B'nai Elion, all of you," although whether this refers to human rulers or members of a divine council is itself debated. The argument here is that sons of God could designate powerful human rulers, perhaps those belonging to royal lines or dynasties, who were seen as ruling by divine right, or who even arrogated divine status to themselves, a practice not unknown in the ancient Near East. The daughters of men, Beno Ha-Hadam, are then understood simply as common women, the subjects or daughters of the general populace. The transgression, therefore, is seen as an abuse of power by these ruling elites. Driven by lust and arrogance, these kings or nobles disregarded social norms and justice. They took them wives of all which they chose is interpreted not just as marriage but as the forceful acquisition of women for their harems, reflecting the tyrannical practices of despotic rulers who exploited their subjects. It's a story of unchecked power leading to oppression and sexual exploitation. What then are the Nephilim and the Gibborim in this interpretation? They are viewed as the offspring of these powerful rulers, or perhaps the rulers themselves and their warrior entourages. They were the mighty men, Gibborim, in a purely earthly sense. Powerful warriors, dynastic heirs, figures who dominated the political and military landscape through force. Their renown, Ansha, Hashan, was fame derived from their power, conquests, or oppressive rule. The term Nephilim might be understood metaphorically. Perhaps these tyrannical figures fell upon the populace, oppressing them or caused others to fall under their dominion. Alternatively, some proponents might see Nephilim simply as a name for a notable group of powerful, perhaps large-statured individuals or warrior clans of that era, without needing a supernatural explanation. The emphasis is on their earthly might and political significance. This interpretation also provides a rationale for the flood called the Flood of Arrogance. The unchecked lust, arrogance, and violence of these powerful rulers contributed significantly to the state of corruption and violence, Hamas in Hebrew, that filled the earth, as described in Genesis chapter 6 verse 11. The abuse of power by the elite, leading to widespread social injustice and bloodshed, is seen as a primary component of the wickedness that provoked God's judgment. The flood becomes a divine response to systemic oppression and the breakdown of just rule within human society. The strength of the human ruler's view lies in its grounding in the plausible socio-political realities of the ancient world. It resonates with historical accounts of powerful kings, dynastic struggles, harems, and the oppression of common people. It avoids the biological difficulties of the fallen angel view, and doesn't rely on tracing specific religious lineages like the Sethite view. It interprets the passage as a critique of tyrannical power and its corrupting influence, a theme certainly present elsewhere in the Bible. Variations of this view have been proposed by various scholars, particularly those emphasizing the ancient Near Eastern background of Genesis. However, like the Sethite view, this interpretation faces the challenge that Bene Elohim is more naturally understood as referring to divine beings based on its usage elsewhere. Attributing it solely to human rulers requires choosing a less common potential meaning for Elohim. Furthermore, critics might argue that this view, while plausible socially, somewhat demythologizes the passage, potentially failing to account for the highly unusual nature of the Nephilim, especially if later biblical texts associate them with giants, and the extreme severity of the flood as a response solely to bad governance, however wicked. Does it fully capture the sense of profound, almost cosmic disruption hinted at in the text? The human ruler's interpretation offers a compelling reading of Genesis 6 as a commentary on power, justice, and tyranny within human society. It frames the pre-flood world's corruption in terms of political and social breakdown, driven by the arrogance and lust of earthly potentates. While perhaps less widespread historically than the angel or Sethite views, it provides a valuable perspective rooted in the historical and cultural context in which Genesis emerged, highlighting the dangers of unchecked human power. The 4 brief verses in Genesis 6 offer a tantalizingly incomplete picture. They hint at cosmic transgression and legendary figures, but leave many questions unanswered. However, to fully grasp the historical weight of the fallen angel interpretation and understand how the Nephilim narrative evolved, we must venture beyond the canonical Bible into other ancient Jewish writings. Foremost among these is the fascinating and deeply influential collection known as the Book of Enoch, or more specifically, 1st Enoch. The Book of Enoch is not part of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, or the standard Protestant Old Testament canon, although it is considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and the Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo Church. It's an ancient Jewish apocalyptic text, likely compiled from different sections written between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. Crucially, fragments of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirming its existence and importance within Judaism during the Second Temple period, the very era when early Christian beliefs were forming. It purports to contain revelations given to Enoch, the biblical figure who walked with God and was taken by God before the flood. What makes Enoch so relevant to our discussion is that it takes the bare bones of Genesis 6 and fleshes them out into a detailed, epic narrative squarely centered on the fallen angel interpretation. The section known as the Book of the Watchers, roughly chapters 6 through 36, begins almost immediately by retelling the Genesis story, but with far more specifics. It names the leaders of the rebellious angels, or watchers, identifying Shemahazah as their chief, and mentions others like Azazel. It describes 200 watchers descending on Mount Hermon, driven by lust for human women, and making a pact to carry out their plan. According to Enoch, their sin wasn't just sexual union. It was also about revealing forbidden heavenly secrets to humanity, Azazel, for instance, is credited with teaching humans metalworking for weapons, swords, knives, shields, leading to warfare. He also taught the use of cosmetics and valuable stones, seen as promoting vanity and deception. Other angels taught sorcery, astrology, and other illicit knowledge, corrupting human society from within and contributing massively to the wickedness that Genesis mentions. And the offspring of these unions, the Nephilim, are portrayed in Enoch in terrifying detail. They are depicted as giants of immense stature. 1 Enoch chapter 7 claims they were 3,000 cubits high, a clear exaggeration, emphasizing their monstrous nature. These giants consumed all of humanity's resources. When food ran out, Enoch graphically describes them turning on humans, devouring their flesh, and even turning on each other, drinking blood. They filled the earth with violence and injustice, becoming the primary agents of the corruption that cried out to heaven for judgment. Enoch describes how the cries of oppressed humanity reached heaven, prompting the righteous archangels like Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel to appeal to God. God then commissions the flood to cleanse the earth of the giants and the corrupted human race. He also commands the archangels to bind the fallen watchers, particularly Azazel, and imprison them in darkness beneath the earth until the final judgment. This provides a detailed backstory for the flood and introduces concepts about the judgment of fallen angels that resonated deeply in later thought. Furthermore, Enoch suggests the disembodied spirits of the dead giants become evil spirits or demons, continuing to plague humanity after the flood. The influence of Enoch on early Jewish and Christian thought regarding Genesis 6 cannot be overstated. Its detailed fallen angel narrative became the default understanding for many. This is reflected even within the New Testament itself. The Epistle of Jude contains passages that seem to directly allude to Enoch's account. Verse 6 speaks of angels who did not keep their own domain but abandoned their proper abode, whom God has kept in eternal bonds under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. This closely mirrors Enoch's description of the imprisoned watchers. Even more strikingly, Jude, verses 14 and 15, directly quote 1 Enoch chapter 1 verse 9, attributing it to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. Similarly, 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 mentions God casting sinful angels into Tartarus, a Greek term for a deep abyss, used here likely influenced by Enoch's descriptions of the angels' prison, and committing them to chains of gloomy darkness. These New Testament passages strongly suggest that the authors, and likely their audiences, were familiar with and influenced by the traditions elaborated in the Book of Enoch, particularly the fallen angel interpretation of Genesis 6. While not scripture for most, the Book of Enoch provides invaluable insight into how Genesis 6 was understood in the crucial period leading up to and including the time of Jesus and the apostles. It took the enigmatic verses about the sons of God, daughters of men and Nephilim, and expanded them into a foundational myth explaining the origin of extreme evil, the necessity of the flood, and the fate of rebellious celestial beings. Understanding a night check is key to understanding the historical dominance and the enduring power of the fallen angel interpretation. The Book of Enoch doesn't just endorse the fallen angel view, it dramatically expands it, providing names, motives, and specific details that paint a vivid picture of cosmic rebellion and its devastating earthly consequences. This expanded narrative centers around three interconnected elements: the rebellious angels known as the Watchers, their monstrous offspring, the giants, and the corrupting, forbidden knowledge they imparted to humanity. First, the Watchers. While Genesis speaks generally of sons of God, Enoch identifies them as a specific class of angels, the Irin or Watchers, whose duty was ostensibly to watch over humanity. However, overcome by lust for human women, a group of 200, led by figures like Shemihazah and Azazel, decided to abandon their heavenly posts. According to 1 Enoch, they descended upon Mount Hermon, a real mountain on the border of modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, and swore an oath together, binding themselves to their rebellious plan. This wasn't an accidental fall, it was a deliberate conspiracy, a conscious rejection of their divine mandate. Their primary sin, initiated by lust, was the violation of the boundary between heaven and earth through forbidden unions. But their transgression went beyond sexual sin. Enoch accuses the Watchers, particularly leaders like Azazel, of teaching humans forbidden knowledge, secrets reserved for heaven. This included metallurgy, crafting swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, which inevitably led to increased warfare and bloodshed. They taught the use of cosmetics, dyes, and precious stones, fostering vanity, seduction, and materialism. Other watchers revealed secrets of sorcery, incantations, root cuttings for magical purposes, and astrology, leading humanity away from reliance on God and towards occult practices. This impartation of knowledge is portrayed as a profound source of corruption, accelerating humanity's descent into sin by equipping them with tools for violence, deceit, and rebellion against divine order. Second, the giants. In Enoch's telling, the offspring of the Watchers and human women were the Nephilim, explicitly depicted as giants of terrifying proportions and power. As we noted, Enoch gives hyperbolic heights, emphasizing their unnatural, monstrous status. These giants possessed an insatiable appetite, consuming all the food produced by humans. When legitimate resources were exhausted, their true nature emerged. They began to prey upon humans themselves, devouring mankind, and eventually turned their violence upon each other and other animals, drinking blood and filling the earth with carnage. They were not merely large humans, they were destructive hybrids, the physical embodiment of the Watcher's cosmic sin, acting as the primary instruments of the violence and corruption that plagued the pre-flood world. These three elements, the Watchers' deliberate rebellion and illicit unions, the corrupting influence of the forbidden knowledge they taught, and the ravenous violence of their giant offspring, combined in the Enochian narrative to create a perfect storm of wickedness. The corruption wasn't just human moral failing, it was amplified and accelerated by supernatural interference and the presence of monstrous beings. This potent combination of angelic sin, forbidden technology, and giant-fueled violence provided a compelling, detailed explanation for why the world had become so utterly corrupt that only a cataclysmic flood could cleanse it. It also explained the fate of the fallen Watchers, imprisonment until judgment, and offered an origin story for demons, believed by some Enochic traditions to be the restless, disembodied spirits of the slain giants, continuing to afflict humanity. By adding these layers of detail, identifying the Watchers, specifying the forbidden knowledge, and vividly describing the giants' destructive nature, the Book of Enoch transformed the brief Genesis account into a comprehensive mythology of primordial corruption. It provided answers that Genesis didn't explicitly offer, and created a framework that profoundly influenced how many Jews and early Christians understood the nature of evil, the origins of violence and illicit arts, the reasons for the flood, and the ongoing struggle against demonic forces. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 contains a phrase that has sparked endless debate. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. If the flood wiped out all land-based life except for Noah and his family, how could the Nephilim exist afterward? This puzzle brings us to a dramatic moment in the book of Numbers during the Israelites' journey to the Promised Land. In Numbers chapter 13, Moses sends 12 spies to scout the land of Canaan. 10 of the spies return terrified, giving what the text calls an evil report. Designed to dissuade the Israelites from entering, they describe a formidable land and its inhabitants, culminating in a startling claim. In verses 32 and 33, they report, "The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." This is the only other place in the entire Torah where the word Nephilim appears. The spies explicitly link the people they saw, specifically the sons of Anak, the Anakim, to the legendary Nephilim of the pre-flood era. Their report paints a picture of terrifyingly large and intimidating people, so imposing that the Israelite spies felt insignificant, like grasshoppers in comparison. This passage is crucial because it seems to confirm the presence of Nephilim, or beings identified as Nephilim, long after the flood. But how do we interpret this? Several possibilities exist. Some adhering strictly to the fallen angel view, and a literal reading might speculate that the Nephilim lineage somehow persisted, perhaps through Noah's daughters-in-law, though the Bible emphasizes Noah's family alone was saved. or even propose a second, unmentioned incursion of angels after the flood, a view with little textual support. Others suggest the spies, in their fear and desire to discourage the people, were using hyperbole. They invoked the legendary name Nephilim, known from ancient stories like Genesis 6, to describe the formidable Anakim warriors, essentially saying, "These guys are as terrifying as the legendary giants of old." It was a way to maximize the fear factor. A related view is that Nephilim had become, by that time, a more general term or descriptor for any group of unusually tall, powerful, or fearsome people, regardless of direct lineage back to the Genesis 6 figures. The spies used it to categorize the Anakim based on their intimidating stature. The Anakim mentioned by the spies are not the only such group described in the later books of the Old Testament. The narrative of the conquest of Canaan and surrounding regions frequently mentions other giant or unusually formidable peoples whom the Israelites encountered and displaced. There were the Rephaim, famously associated with Og, the king of Bashan, whose massive iron bedstead is noted in Deuteronomy chapter 3 as a testament to his size. Deuteronomy chapter 2 also mentions the Emim, described as a people great and many and tall as the who previously inhabited the land of Moab, and the Zanzumim, or Zuzim, similarly described as great, numerous and tall, who lived in the land later occupied by the Ammonites and were also considered Rephaim. The Bible seems to group these peoples together, Anakim, Emim, Zamzumim, often describing them using similar terms, great, many, tall, and explicitly linking the Emim and Zamzumim to the Rephaim, Deuteronomy 2 verses 10 to 11 and 20 to 21. The Anakim are also sometimes considered part of the broader category of Rephaim. While the exact relationships are unclear, the texts portray them as remnants of powerful, large-statured populations who occupied parts of Canaan and Transjordan before the arrival of the Israelites, and other groups like the Moabites and Ammonites. Joshua's conquest narrative specifically mentions defeating the Anakim in the hill country, wiping them out except for remnants in Gaza, Gath and Ashdod, Joshua chapter 11 verse Ledit. Goliath, the Philistine giant famously defeated by David, came from Gath, suggesting a possible link to these remnant Anakim populations. So while Genesis 6 introduces the Nephilim in a mysterious pre-flood context, the spies' report in Numbers 13 explicitly connects that name to the Anakim, a known post-flood people described alongside other formidable groups like the Rephaim, Emim and Zamzumim. Whether this connection reflects direct lineage, hyperbolic fear, or the use of Nephilim as a general term for giants remains debated. But what is clear is that the Numbers passage cemented the association of the term Nephilim with the tangible, fearsome, large-statured peoples encountered by the Israelites, ensuring that the legend of giants, originating before the flood, cast a long shadow over Israel's later history and imagination. From just 4 enigmatic verses in Genesis, the story of the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim has cast an astonishingly long shadow. Its ambiguity has fueled centuries of debate, but its core themes of transgression, forbidden unions, power, and judgment have resonated deeply, leaving significant ripples in theology and echoing through culture right up to the present day. Theologically, the impact varied depending on the interpretation favored. The fallen angel view, amplified by texts like Enoch, profoundly shaped early Jewish and Christian understandings of demonology, the origins of sophisticated evil, and the scope of angelic rebellion against God. It provided a framework for understanding a spiritual conflict underlying human history and offered a dramatic explanation for the depth of corruption necessitating the flood. Its echoes in the New Testament letters of Jude and Peter demonstrate its significance in the formative period of Christianity. Conversely, the Sethite and human ruler interpretations, championed later by influential figures like Augustine and Calvin, emphasized themes of human responsibility, the dangers of compromising faith through assimilation with worldly culture, the importance of maintaining godly lineage or community, and critiques of tyrannical earthly power. These views kept the focus squarely on human sin and social dynamics as the drivers of pre-flood corruption. Regardless of the specific interpretation, the Genesis 6 narrative serves as a powerful exploration of boundaries. the boundary between the divine and human realms, the boundary between the sacred and the profane, the righteous and the unrighteous. The transgression, whether cosmic or social, involves the violation of these crucial distinctions, leading inevitably to chaos, corruption, and judgment. The story functions as a potent myth about the dangers inherent in forbidden mixtures and the consequences of overstepping God-ordained limits. Beyond theological discourse, the figures of the Nephilim and the fallen watchers have permeated cultural imagination. The idea of giants, powerful, often monstrous beings born of unusual parentage, is a recurring motif in mythologies worldwide, and the biblical Nephilim became a key reference point within the Judeo-Christian tradition. Fallen angels became central figures in literature, perhaps most famously in John Milton's Paradise Lost, which draws heavily on the broader tradition of angelic rebellion. In modern times, the Nephilim, fallen angels and giants continue to be staples of fantasy literature, film, and gaming, often portrayed as ancient, powerful beings, sometimes enemies, sometimes mysterious precursors to humanity. The story's themes have even been adapted or reinterpreted within fringe theories about ancient astronauts or hidden history, demonstrating its enduring power to capture the imagination and explain perceived anomalies. Ultimately, the story of the Nephilim endures precisely because it remains shrouded in mystery. Was it a literal account of fallen angels and their giant offspring? A cautionary tale about religious intermarriage? A critique of ancient tyranny? Or something else entirely? Its original meaning obscured by time, the lack of definitive answers allows each generation to grapple with its themes of power, sin, forbidden desire, and the terrifying potential for corruption when boundaries are crossed. These few verses continue to provoke, disturb, and inspire, serving as a timeless reminder of a world judged and the enduring questions about the forces, both human and perhaps beyond human, that shape our destiny. We began our journey with just 4 verses from the Book of Genesis, verses describing a strange and troubling time when the sons of God took wives from the daughters of men, resulting in the birth of the Nephilim, the mighty men who were of old men of renown. We've seen how this brief, enigmatic passage has sparked millennia of interpretation, debate, and imagination. Now, let's synthesize what we've explored. We examined the 3 major historical interpretations. The fallen angel view, arguably the most ancient and influential, especially when amplified by texts like the Book of Enoch, sees the sons of God as rebellious divine beings whose unnatural union with human women produced the giant Nephilim and introduced forbidden knowledge leading directly to the flood. This view finds resonance in early Jewish tradition and apparent echoes in the New Testament. The Sethite view reinterprets the sons of God as the righteous lineage of Seth and the daughters of men as the worldly lineage of Cain, framing the transgression as religious apostasy through intermarriage, a loss of godly distinction. This became a prominent view within later Christian theology, emphasizing human responsibility. The human ruler's view offers a socio-political reading, identifying the sons of God as powerful, perhaps tyrannical kings or nobles who abused their power by forcefully taking wives from the common populace, with the Nephilim being their powerful offspring or warrior entourages. This view grounds the story in the realities of ancient Near Eastern power structures. We saw how crucial extra-biblical texts, particularly the Book of Enoch, were in fleshing out the fallen angel narrative, providing details about the Watchers, forbidden knowledge, and the giants' destructive nature that profoundly shaped later understanding. We also confronted the puzzle of the Nephilim appearing afterward, exploring the spy's report in Numbers 13, which explicitly links the Anakim of Canaan to the pre-flood Nephilim, and noting the presence of other formidable clans like the Rephaim, Emim, and Zamzumim in the biblical record. So, what can we definitively conclude? Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that certainty remains elusive. Each interpretation carries strengths and weaknesses. The fallen angel view aligns well with the most common usage of B'nai Elohim and the dramatic tone of the passage, but presents theological and biological challenges for some. The Sethite and human ruler views offer more naturalistic explanations, rooted in human society, but arguably struggle to account for the unique language used and the specific mention of the Nephilim. especially if connected to later giants. The fragmentary nature of the Genesis text itself leaves gaps that later traditions, like Enoch, rushed to fill, making it difficult to perfectly disentangle the original intent from subsequent interpretations. Linguistic ambiguities, cultural distance, and the passage's sheer brevity mean that definitive proof favoring one view exclusively is likely impossible to attain. Yet the enduring power of Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4 lies not in providing simple answers, but in raising profound questions. It speaks to timeless themes: the abuse of power, the allure of the forbidden, the violation of sacred boundaries, the nature of sin and corruption, the relationship between the divine and the human, and the inevitability of judgment in the face of pervasive wickedness. Whether understood as a tale of cosmic rebellion, religious compromise, or political tyranny, the story serves as a potent archetype of a world spiraling into chaos before divine intervention. The Nephilim remain figures of mystery, giants of legend born from an enigmatic union described in the dawn of biblical history. Their story, woven through scripture, apocrypha, and millennia of interpretation, continues to challenge our understanding of the ancient world, the nature of evil, and the complex tapestry of the biblical narrative itself. It reminds us that some mysteries endure, inviting not easy answers, but continued reflection on the profound depths of scripture and the human condition. And so, we are left facing the enduring enigma of the Nephilim. These figures, born from a union described in just a few cryptic lines, stand like colossal statues half buried in the sands of time. Their exact nature, angelic hybrids, powerful tyrants, legendary warriors, or symbols of human corruption, remains debated, shrouded by the ambiguities of ancient language and the vast distance separating us from their world. The Genesis text hints rather than explains. Was the original audience expected to understand references now lost to us? Does the passage preserve a fragment of a much larger, more complex mythology? Did later interpretations, like those found in Enoch, capture the original spirit or overlay it with new concerns? These questions linger, forming the heart of the Nephilim's persistent mystery. Yet perhaps it is this very enigma that fuels their lasting fascination. The Nephilim represent the unknown, the powerful other, the hint of a world more complex and perhaps more dangerous than our everyday understanding allows. They embody the allure of the forbidden, the consequences of power unchecked, and the echoes of a primordial age where the boundaries between heaven and earth seem terrifyingly thin. Their story taps into deep-seated human curiosities about origins, power, transgression, and the potential for monstrous realities lurking just beyond the veil of the known. The Nephilim may remain forever enigmatic, their true story locked away in the distant past, but their presence in the biblical narrative, however brief, serves as a powerful, unsettling reminder, a testament to a world judged long ago, and a symbol of mysteries that continue to echo through the ages, inviting us to wonder, to question, and to explore the deepest layers of meaning within these ancient texts. The mighty men of old, the men of renown, remain giants in our imagination. What secrets do you think still lie hidden? Let us know in the comments below. For more explorations into the unexplained, subscribe to the Purple Files. Thanks for watching.